We have a reading today from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's from the 30th chapter, and it begins with the 19th verse, and it's very appropriate for what we just sang. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying and holding fast to God, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Here ends the reading.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke, the 20th chapter, beginning with the 9th verse. He began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants and went to another country for a long time. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next, he sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted and sent away empty-handed. And he sent still a third. This one also they wounded and threw out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyards to others. When they heard this, they said, "Heaven forbid." But he looked at them and said, "What then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the scribes and chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people. This is the word of the Lord. The Lord's name be praised.
Today we begin a sermon series based on a new book by the Reverend Adam Hamilton. You may have heard of Reverend Adam Hamilton. He's the senior pastor at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. He has a new book out called Half-Truths: God Helps Those Who Help Themselves, and Other Things the Bible Doesn't Say. The Church of the Resurrection, by the way, has been noted as one of the most influential mainline churches in America. How many of you have ever heard these words? Everything happens for a reason. Yes. All right. Lots of us have heard those words. Now, this you need to be a little brave about. How many times have you thought them or even said them yourselves? Oh, less hands going up. All right. It's pretty common to hear these words, especially in times of suffering or pain, in times of grief or tragedy or even loss. I heard someone say these words just the other day. It was a morning news person wondering about the train crash that happened at the Hoboken, New Jersey terminal this past week. The truth is, we probably all have said these words at some time in our lives. I know that I've probably said them. Or if we haven't said these words, maybe we've said other words just like them. It was part of God's plan. or it's God's will, or even it was meant to be. And sometimes such words can be comforting. There is some comfort in being able to tell ourselves that God is still in control in this life, that what has happened to us or what has happened in the world is still part of God's good plan. There is some truth and some comfort to the idea or the notion that everything happens for a reason. But not always. Because you see, there is another truth to these words, a truth that, if we are honest, sometimes disturbs us. Because to say that some terrible event occurs in this world or in our lives is the will of God, that everything happens for a reason, also implies somehow God willed this terrible event, this horrible thing, to happen. And if God willed this terrible event, this horrible thing to happen, then it often becomes very difficult for us to believe in a God who is all-loving and all-good, a God who wants only the best for us, who is watching over us, caring for us, and always working for our good. Ultimately, what is crucial to every Christian person's journey of faith is the question, what do we believe about God, and what do we believe about the world in which we find ourselves? That's what we're about to discover as we look at some of the half-truths that we, as Christians, often say to one another. Things like, everything happens for a reason. God helps those who help themselves. God won't give you more than you can handle. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And love the sinner, hate the sin. All things we like to say to one another, but are what we would call half-truths. Half-truths that aren't things the Bible says. So let's get started. We live in a world of cause and effect. Listen to what Adam Hamilton says about this. Actions create consequences. Our own choices produce results. A result of choosing to text while driving may be a collision in which someone is injured. Because we live in a world of cause and effect, texting while driving could cause an accident. In the scripture that we read from Deuteronomy just a few moments ago, Moses is giving instructions to the Israelites as they get ready to enter the promised land for the first time. And he reminds them again about cause and effect. And he says, choose life. Live under God's law, love God, love your neighbor, follow God's ways, and life will be good for you and for the community. Choose anything else, and you will die. Cause and effect. If I get on the 101 and drive 100 miles an hour in the middle of a rainstorm, and I weave in and out of traffic, how long do you think I'm going to last? There is an order to the universe. There is something called gravity. There are laws of physics, cause and effect. Everything that happens for a reason. Well, in that case, probably yes, but maybe not always. A conversation about cause and effect doesn't help much when we are talking about matters of faith, because it leads us down all kinds of crazy theological paths, particularly when we say everything happens for a reason and we start to talk about God's will. Like I said a moment ago, it was God's will implies that all the bad things that happen in life are part of God's master plan for us. Predetermined. God somehow wills these things to happen to us. Aside from making it harder for us to believe in a God who is all-loving and all-good, there is another problem with everything happens for a reason. It relieves us from any personal responsibility that we bear for what happens in our lives. Back out there during that rainstorm, driving on the 101 like a bat out of you-know-where, I caused a 30-car pileup at the exit ramp to Bell Road. Must have been God's will. It was preordained by God that I would do this because everything happens for a reason. God must have wanted me to do this to accomplish God's purpose, which in turn actually makes it all God's responsibility. Yeah, that's the ticket. Hear how I turned that around and put the responsibility on God? I'm not responsible. It's all God's fault. Which is the second problem with the half-truth. Everything that happens is God's responsibility, not mine. But wait, there's more to this half-truth. Since God has already predetermined how things are going to turn out for me in this life, the good, the bad, the ugly, since it's all God's will, why bother with caring at all about what I do in this life? There's a word for such thinking. We call it fatalism. Listen to how Adam Hamilton describes it. A fatalist thinks whatever's going to happen will happen. Whatever will be, will be. We're powerless to change it. If you are a committed fatalist, there is no reason to ever wear a seatbelt. If you are meant to die in a car accident, you will. If you're not meant to die, you won't. If you take a fatalistic view, why work out or eat healthy foods or care for your body? After all, when it's your time, it's your time. Diagnosed with cancer? If you're a fatalist, don't waste time seeing an oncologist. To seek treatment would be to resist God's will. It was God, after all, who gave you cancer in the first place. Everything happens for a reason. Can you hear the problem with this statement of belief? Let me add another more relevant example. Since God has already predetermined who's going to win in the upcoming election, why bother voting? Fatalistic thinking. Now, right about now, if you have a Presbyterian background, you're probably thinking to yourself, this all sounds awfully familiar, and it should. John Calvin was a pastor and a lawyer who lived from 1509 to 1564. He was a reformer who shaped much of Protestant theology in his time. Calvin was the guy who came up with the whole idea of theological determinism. Now that sounds like a mouthful, but basically, Calvin believed that in order for God to be fully sovereign, and what we mean by that is it's another way of saying king of the universe, as our Jewish friends believe, or put it this way, large and in charge, having authority over everything in creation. in order for God to be fully sovereign, then God must be the cause of everything that happens in the universe. God must will it to happen. So whatever happens in your life and in mine, be it good, be it bad, be it ugly, must reflect what God desires for you and must fulfill God's purpose for you. Here's an example from Calvin's time. The ability for a couple to conceive a child was God's will. Calvin knew nothing about infertility back in those days. Here's another example. A man cuts his hand on a rusty farm implement and dies of tetanus. Must have been God's will. Calvin knew nothing about antibiotics. Theological determinism. Whatever happens to you must be the will of God because God is in control of all things in the universe. Even whether you go to hell or you meet St. Peter at the pearly gates when you die, it's already been predetermined. That's what Calvin proposed in his book, Institutes of Christian Religion. Now we have to remember that he was only 27 at the time, which may account for some of the, how should I say this, maybe blind spots in his theological treatise. My apologies to our Presbyterian friends this morning, but I'll stand the Wesleyan quadrilateral head to head with theological determinism any day. I'll get to what United Methodists believe about all of this in a minute, but bear with me for one more thought. Remember when I said a few moments ago that ultimately what is crucial to every Christian person's journey of faith is the question, what do we believe about God and about what do we believe about the world in which we find ourselves? Well, on the flip side of Calvin, who probably got us started with all of this everything happens for a reason stuff. Again, my apologies to our Presbyterians turned United Methodist. On the flip side of Calvin, there is something called deism. Now, deism is a theological philosophy that seeks to answer another of the problems with this half-truth, everything happens for a reason. Deism states that after God created the world and everything in it, the earth, the universe, God basically adopted a hands-off approach. Rather than God having dominion over the universe, dominion over the earth, dominion over the creation, God put the whole thing on autopilot. So everything happens for a reason because God is no longer invested in the world. Would it surprise you to know that many of our nation's founders were enamored with deism? George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. By the way, did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote his own Bible? He basically took out everything that he didn't believe in the original Bible, and what was left was 87 pages of what Jefferson himself could believe. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Paine, just to name a few. Now, it's true that most of them subscribed mainly to Christianity, but each of them also had deist leanings. You can find much of this in their writings. Again, Adam Hamilton. Deism avoids the theological problem of condemning certain people to hell before they're born. It eludes the problem of accidents and human suffering, are all part of God's plan. The problem with deism is that it makes no room at all for God to be at work in the world. If deism is true, then God did not liberate the Israelite slaves from Egypt. If deism is true, then God did not send the prophets. If deism is true, then God did not send Jesus to show us the way or to save us from ourselves. God's Spirit does not dwell within us. Creation is not an ongoing act, and God is not involved in any way in our lives. That's deism. Calvinism and deism. We are not deists, nor are we Calvinists. United Methodists are to be found somewhere in between those two polar opposites. You see, to be a Christian is to hold on to the belief that God does seek to be involved in our lives and in the world. To be a United Methodist Christian is to believe that God also seeks to involve humanity in the workings of the world, to work for justice, to work for peace, to work to redeem the violence that happens among peoples, and to bend the evil that we experience in this world toward the will of God, so that something good can finally come out of it. To be a Christian is to hold the belief that God is sovereign of the universe, still large and in charge. But to be a United Methodist Christian is to recognize that while God is sovereign, God also gives human beings dominion over God's creation and gives us free will. Dominion and free will are great gifts until we forget that they are given to us for a reason. To work for God's purposes and not our own. Jesus actually told us a story about this very thing, and we just read it a few moments ago. The parable of the wicked tenants who beat up the owner of the vineyard's servants and even killed the owner's son when the owner sent the servants and then finally sent the son to remind the tenants that they weren't doing a very good job of tending the vineyard. Everything happens for a reason is a half-truth, because human beings are sometimes just plain stupid and make bad decisions. To be a United Methodist Christian is to recognize that we are co-partners with God in this world, and we bear responsibility for its care and for the care of its people. Now, to be a Christian is to recognize that horrible things sometimes happen in this life, but that no matter what happens, death is not the final word. To be a United Methodist Christian is to believe that God is still always with us, always redeeming us, always working to bring good out of the horrible things that happen, and God will never, ever leave us alone, even to the point of death and our life on this earth ends, even after. This week, a commuter train jumped the rails and plowed into a train station in Hoboken, New Jersey. One person died and 108 were seriously injured. Did God cause that train to derail? A United Methodist Christian would say no. No. But a United Methodist Christian would also ask this question, but was God there in the midst of that human suffering, making God's presence known, making God's will known to all? And a United Methodist Christian would say, oh yes, oh yes. Because many of the regular commuters who were in that station at the time immediately raced over to that train once it had stopped to get the injured out of the wreckage and help get them to a place of safety for treatment by the first responders. Everything happens for a reason. It's only half true, because it leaves us with an understanding of a God who is only half true. A God who either micromanages everything or a God who leaves us completely alone and to our own devices. John Wesley knew that half-truths are not helpful. And so he left us with a prayer to keep us in balance, to remind us that we are partners with God in this life, and that in yielding our own lives to God, God will never be absent from us, but always be present with us, using us for God's good purposes in the world, loving us and giving us guidance when we need it, always being present for us. That prayer is on the front cover of your bulletin this morning. It will be there every week throughout this sermon series. And so I invite you to use it in your own prayer life each and every day as we continue this discussion of half-truths. Next week, we'll be talking about the half-truth, God helps those who help themselves. And don't forget that if you want to continue more with this discussion, come and join us in the class that we're offering on this very book, Half-Truths. You can join us then. It's listed in your bulletin for the time and the place. I hope you'll think about it. See you in church. Amen.